Excellent. Thank you so much, Ava. Thank you so much for the invitation to be in the space. It's lovely to see all of you, and I look forward to some unmuting and getting to know all of you a little bit better. So I was very excited to be invited to be a part of this morning session because I think this is hugely, hugely important. I'm also really looking forward to Christina and Sheila's presentations and then to a dialogue afterwards. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour, but I did want, as I'd been invited to do, to share a little bit about questions around knowledge and how we think about that in our research, because I think we take this for granted and it's something that I've been working on for a long time. So as I said, very pleased to be invited to share it with all of you. So I'll spend my 10 minutes trying to set out an overview of the conceptual problems I think we sort of have to contend with when we think about our research and whose knowledge counts. So for me, the starting point here is that colonialism has irredeemably shaped the world. And here I want to point very particularly to the proliferation of capitalism. And this also includes that fundamental shift in the production distribution relations of so much of the world. And I point to this because the ways in which we divide up our labor, and then we think about who has the right to comment on the ways in which we've divided up that labor and then how the world works, that has consequences for then whose knowledge counts even now. Okay, so we haven't fundamentally moved away from the particular form of living and thinking and dividing up of labor that was proliferated, particularly with European empire, which then has persisted into what we might call a sort of neo-colonialism, where Europe is sort of still conceptually at the center, but obviously the US is as well. Okay, so what that means for us now is that we know the world in a particular way. So here this is a quote from Robin Dunford, sort of talking about the ways in which European colonialism had a particular, what he calls matrix of values. So Christianity, civilization, notions of development and liberal democracy. And we can see that playing out in some of the contemporary wars, that including the most recent with very dramatic withdrawal from Afghanistan. A lot of these words were the reason for going into Afghanistan in 2001 in the first place, right? And we can see the ways in which some of our concerns in the context of development were also tied up with that. So, we're going to Afghanistan to empower women, and that's part of, messages of liberation and this idea that liberal democracy is what various parts of the world needs. So Dunford's critique, I think, is really valid here in the sense that different modes of living are crushed in the name of this idea of universal global designs. So what does that mean then for research, right? So if we are doing research, what we tend to take for granted then is the ways in which we conceptualize knowledge as a kind of unproblematic thing, an entity, something tangible. And here, drawing on Lal, the idea that, more than Coca-Cola and Disney, it's the frameworks of knowledge encapsulated in the academic disciplines which have become universalized. So we have very particularized ways of knowing in higher education, in development, and that includes development research, where development has a tendency to mean something quite fixed and increasingly sort of, I don't know, I think I'm fairly confident I speak for most people who work in development research, quite a lot being aligned with the SDGs. And so that has effects in terms of what we do and don't talk about, and kind of a form of self-censorship, because we know that that's what the expectation is in terms of the research that we're going to produce. So one of the ways in which then that there have been critiques around these knowledge norms in higher education has been in relation to coloniality and calls to decolonize the curriculum. That may be very familiar. So it's worth sort of taking this one head on a little bit. And in some ways, this is a reasonable demand, right? If we look at where the ideas for how we live, how we think, how we conceptualize the world, the idea that we draw substantially and well, disproportionately on what lots of people call dead white men, does seem to be a perfectly reasonable critique. Politics, philosophy, economics, the ideas that matter about how the world could and should work are dominated by the Adam Smiths, Thomas Malthus, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and Michel Foucault's. And the colonial enterprise itself was a lens or even a laboratory to test ideas around modernity. So again, this is a point that Dunford makes. And there is a truth. There is a truth to the charge that it's dead white men that dominate our intellectual landscape and how we conceptualize the world. But here I would add a note of caution. There is a danger that we simply essentialize all white men and replace them with white women or brown, black men or women. This, in my view, is lazy. And it has been one of the bases of critique in my own work, in that we must not think in a homogenous way about people developed versus developing, global north versus global south. We couldn't argue that all of these thinkers think the same thing. So obviously whiteness shapes how they think, but that doesn't mean that as a result of that, they all have the same ideas. It's far from the truth. It's lazy just to think that we're going to have shallow sort of diversity to tackle this question of how we might know differently in our development research. We need to move beyond thinking it's enough to simply change the race, gender, or status of the messenger, and instead raise more fundamental questions about the message. Okay, so how do we know in development then? So one of the things I'd like to draw attention to, which is something that is a preoccupation in my own work, is the language of our practice. Strikingly for me, we are having this conversation as part of a global partnership with Finnish and Indian universities or academic spaces, but we're talking in English. And there is no imperative for me to learn any other language. And I move quite freely at the moment and have done so because of the going online in the pandemic with colleagues from all over the world. And there is no pressure on me to learn anything other than English, because the language of our practice in development research, as we are indeed proving in this space, is English. Regardless of the other languages you might speak, we are always moving our ideas into English, and not just any kind of English, a professionalized, jargonized academic English. And the price for participation is to be able to move through that set of ideas using that jargon in a very particularized way. And degrees gained from the global north come as part of that. There is also a tendency for us to draw on Western frameworks that then are seen as universalized. So the SDG framework is the most obvious one, but the SDG framework itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. It encapsulates ideas that have been brought together, including through competing tensions at the global level between, where the World Bank situates itself and where the UN situates itself. And yes, to an extent, it does center human beings, but it does present us with a universalized set of ideas that draw substantially on how we might see the good life in the global north. There is also a homogenizing tendency of development labels or categories. So we will talk volubly about the grassroots or the local. There's a big drive for localization, which we can talk about. And where is that even? Where is the local? Who is the grassroots? What are we expecting their people to be doing or thinking or engaging with there? Why is this even a there? These are not homogenous places. And so this is something, again, in my own work, I've been keen to draw out, because I think that sort of essentializing is quite lazy and potentially quite dangerous. But then how we know in development institutions is also the institutional structures. They're hierarchical, they're professionalized, so only certain people are allowed to participate. We live in higher education structures that are competitive, not collaborative. And those research structures are all much more about competition, not collaboration. There's lots of talk of partnership, indeed, as this session is trying to draw out, but we can see how hard that is, because we are not incentivized to behave in that way in the institutional context that we operate in. We tend to privilege notions of expertise, which would then automatically exclude the views and ideas of some people over others. Development knowledge is not a neutral thing. It has its own politics and power relations where certain ideas have purchase over others. And of course, there's the historical tendency, which we haven't moved away from, where development is seen as a technical solution. There's a certain thing I can do. I can build a school. I can dig a well. If I can just get this vaccine in there, all of which may be quite good things to do. It's not to suggest that we shouldn't do those things, but trying to do those things in isolation of understanding why those problems exist in the first place means that we have this tendency, which has its own historical antecedent, to see development as a technical problem that then needs a technical solution. So I would want to draw attention to the work of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, sort of talking about research and this idea that knowledge norms for attempts to try to build partnership, thinking through how we bring our partners into the spaces that we're in, very often will actually almost fail at the first hurdle, because associated HE systems and methodologies neither require us nor support us even to consider whether we're even the right people to be asking the questions in the first place, let alone whether we are then the right people to be undertaking the research, should we manage to determine that a problem even exists that needs solving or understanding further, right? So we start in our research by sort of already identifying a problem. And very often we'll do that at our desk, or we might do that with a small group of colleagues or a couple of partners, but actually we might be responding to a funding call. And so we're very limited. And Tuhiwai-Smith's work's really important here, because she's sort of saying we would go, lots of us will go in good faith into those engagements, under thinking that we're doing something really, really important, but maybe we're not even the right people to be doing it. And actually, it's not even appropriate for us to be in those spaces. So I'll end here, Ava, because I am a little bit over. But basically, we need to think then about whose knowledge counts in our research. We need to think about that these are ethical questions, I would argue. And we need a continuous reflection about the range of voices, views, and ideas we seek out, as well as how we gather and then choose to codify and represent them. We need to think about the methodological implications of our choices. We need to actively problematize the rules that govern our research and the partnerships that we're trying to build in order to undertake that research. So we need to think about who's participating, what language we're using, and not just jargon, but is it English? Is that even appropriate? What does a long-term research strategy look like? And this point, I think, is really important. We need to challenge how we incorporate our partners in our research, and in particular, how we incorporate Global South voices and knowledges into our research and associated publications. We do have a tendency to incorporate them as local voices, giving us so-called grassroots perspectives. And then somebody like me would then be invited to offer my pearls of wisdom, giving a global overview. But what if we saw people from the Global South as global experts who might perhaps have something to say about the climate or gender equality beyond their context? What if they had a comment on the Global North? And we literally never do this. So that's a challenge for us all to take on and think about our partnerships in a different way. So we need to talk, and then finally, we need to talk about power. What kind of life do people want? Whose ideas about sustainable development count, and who gets to decide what progress or empowerment look like? Here, we need to think more carefully about how we diversify the voices that are allowed to define what we mean by these terms. Can we work progressively within the model that we work? I look forward to that discussion when we come together in the workshop elements, but thank you very much, and apologies I've gone over. But
thanks, Lata. Really thought-provoking, and I think it fits very well into Christina's presentation, which is about those very key concepts and ideas you presented in practice. So Christina, if you could come on.
Yes, thank you very much. That was so interesting, Lata, and hello everybody. So I am Christina Swiderska, a principal researcher at IIED, International Institute for Environment and Development. And I'm going to talk about decolonising action research with Indigenous peoples. So just very briefly to go over some of these terms. Colonisation, political and military control for economic benefit, so natural resource extraction, imposed administrative structures, and culture and values and language and religion. But there's a difference between that and coloniality, which refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. And then the coloniality of knowledge is exemplified by specific knowledge being prioritized over other knowledge. So decolonization has been defined as an ongoing ethical and political project that seeks to analyze and rethink the world from the perspective of indigenous and other colonized peoples, and to disturb and reformulate the unequal power relations that characterized the colonial present in post-colonial and settler societies. And decolonization of knowledge has been defined as a group of processes and actions that intentionally dismantle the entrenched, unequal patterns of knowledge creation and use that emanate from our colonial past. So I'm going to talk about these issues in the context of indigenous peoples. And there are about 476 million indigenous peoples worldwide across 90 countries. And they have often suffered violent colonization and dispossession of their lands and natural resources. And they continue to suffer economic and political marginalization and racism, and are experiencing a rapid loss of their traditional knowledge and culture and ways of life, which are really important for addressing global challenges of sustainability as well as local livelihoods. So existing research approaches, conventional academic research with indigenous peoples is, in my opinion, unethical and extractive. Others have said it has brought few benefits to indigenous peoples and has subjected them to multiple harm. Poor people are asked to give their time. Their knowledge is not valued. External researchers gain publications and status and careers, and the supremacy of white knowledge is perpetuated through these conventional research approaches. And they do also represent a form of colonialism. Researchers use external theories to define the research problem. They use external methods. And in doing so, they're reinforcing external values and perceptions of what is reality, of what is true, what counts as knowledge, and what knowledge is important. And some have noted that Western methods are actually stripping marginalized groups of their ancestral culture and replacing it with Euro-Western culture. And others have also said, particularly indigenous peoples, that externally led research is also less effective. Scientists can never fully understand indigenous peoples without actively engaging them in research. That's a quote from an Umboroboro pastoralist in Chad that participated in a virtual workshop we had in 2020 rather. So decolonizing research approaches, they challenge existing power structures and ways of knowledge production. They value indigenous knowledge and indigenous research methods, and they aim to support the self-determination of indigenous peoples. They begin with a critique of colonial relations in past research, and they aim to ensure that research is more respectful, ethical, sympathetic, and useful for indigenous peoples. They are shaped by indigenous peoples' struggles to resist and survive the assault on their culture. And they target locally defined problems. So it's not the external researchers that identify the research topic and problem, it's indigenous peoples. And they are based on indigenous research paradigms, theories, concepts, and methods. And they seek to revitalize indigenous knowledge, worldviews, concepts, and values. So in this way, indigenous peoples actually become the research leaders, even if they're non-literate or not schooled. And external researchers become facilitators, political activists. They get indigenous people's voices heard, and they promote social transformation. So this slide is to illustrate what we mean by indigenous worldviews. This is taken from the Andean Ailu concept, which basically means community. And the view of the world is divided into these three Ailus or communities. The Runa Ailu, which is the human and all domesticated plants and animals. The Salka Ailu, which is the sacred, and the Auki Ailu, which is the wild and or landscapes and mountains. And these three Ailus have to be in balance to achieve well-being. So in other words, that is what the view of a good life is, of buen vivir. So development, humans, and the environment have to be in balance. There isn't a separate concept for development, economic development, and environmental conservation. These are together, they're part of the same thing. And this is some pictures of communities in Peru, in the Andes, where the research I'm going to talk about now comes from, the methodologies come from. This is the Potato Park, which is an area of about nearly 10,000 hectares, which is collectively managed by 6 indigenous Quechua communities based on their customary laws. So IIED's research for some time, the work I've been doing, has basically been using this concept of biocultural heritage as a framework. And biocultural heritage is a concept that came from these Quechua communities in the previous slide. Our partner in this work is an indigenous NGO, and Alejandro Argumedo, who's a research leader who we work with, an indigenous research leader, he proposed this concept as an alternative to Western notions of biodiversity or culture, which are separate. And this, using this framework, has enabled IIED to fund research, but not impose colonial concepts and methods. So some key characteristics of this research, it's been used, decolonising action research method that's come from this Andean context, has been very effective approach for establishing this collectively managed landscape, the Potato Park biocultural territory near Cusco in Peru. And the key features of it are that the research is a community-led process. Indigenous community researchers are appointed by and accountable to village authorities. They're not accountable to the external project. And they are paid researchers. So this creates employment, so direct benefits for communities. It's very much a power equalizing process. It starts with free, prior and informed consent, which is really important for communities to impose conditions or say no, and to reconceptualize any proposed research. And it starts with research design workshops where indigenous communities come together and decide on the concepts and the research methods and approaches. It uses the ILU framework, which I presented as a basic framework for research, and indigenous methods like participatory transects, UPANA weight matrix ranking, storytelling, walking workshops, lots of oral methods and horizontal learning between communities. And it aims to enhance capacity for research and policy influence, and to strengthen local institutions and networks between communities, and to establish a knowledge base within communities rather than externally. It's very much action orientated, so it addresses community challenges, and it contributes to establishing biocultural heritage territories, which aim to secure the rights of indigenous communities to their land and to self-determination. So the research uses a dual action and research framework. And it's been very sustainable in terms of building strong local ownership over research and having lasting impacts that the after projects have finished, and creating social movements at local level. So this is just a picture of some of the community researchers and our partner Alejandro in green at the back. They're from the Potato Park, and that's been scaled up to the Barton Maze Park. And we had a workshop on indigenous research methods. And from that, I've been working with communities in other countries, in Kenya, India, and China, to try and support and capacity building to establish similar processes in these other very different contexts. Okay, so just quickly to illustrate the approach. So it uses decolonising methods, which are essentially principles, and then indigenous research methods, stories, and led by community researchers, and then it also integrates participatory action research methods to support that. So just to finish off then, what we've found is that decolonising action research can and should be scaled out to these other very different contexts in Kenya, India and China. But because they are politically and legally very different, and there's weak decolonisation movements and weak indigenous movements, the language and the tools need to be adapted to these contexts. There's also quite much weaker traditional knowledge in many cases. So there's more sort of research to find what are the concepts, indigenous concepts to use to guide research. The choice of partners is important for this kind of work, looking beyond academia, looking for indigenous organizations. And what is really important is trying to find a flexible and open, unrestricted funding. But it's really hard to find because obviously with research proposals, you normally have to write detailed proposals. So there's a real need to raise awareness of donors and to try and use seed funding for methodology workshops, project design workshops before you develop the proposal. And it's important to keep these fundamental objectives of Indigenous peoples in mind, that support to rights to land and self-determination, and to address community challenges and ensure livelihood benefits are generated as part of these projects. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. I'll just move on straight to Sheila because I'm aware of time and I want to be able to give people time to ask questions. So Sheila, if you could come on, please.
So hi, everybody. It's been amazing education for me to listen to Lata and to Christina. And my journey and my story is very different because I don't see myself as a researcher. I am an activist. I started working in Mumbai with women who lived on the pavements, supporting them to stop evictions. And our journey has never been one of examining ourselves in a research context, but more about looking at how the insights that emerge from our own experiences can help us address the challenges that poor women face when they have to deal with threats of eviction every month. This is as far back as 1984. So we started off by dealing with women who are essentially migrants, who considered themselves as people who were illiterate, came from very poor landless homes in rural areas, and then came with their children without tickets to Mumbai in search of their husbands who were here, and then ended up camping on the pavements of the city. They considered themselves completely inadequate, ill-equipped, ill-informed, which juxtaposed against me as a middle-class worker who was working with them, amazed at their ingenuity and their ability to survive. Imagine coming for a 48-hour journey in a train without any money and evading the ticket collector, getting food from all the other passengers. And what we started off is by everybody telling their stories. And first of all, supporting and acknowledging the amazing power of survival that these processes showed. We didn't know what we were doing in terms of gathering data or anything, but we used to record these stories. And when our friends who were researchers listen to them, they say, these are wonderful stories. We should make a research out of it. And we said, no, we don't want to do research. We want to look at what we can do with it. And to cut a long story short, between 1984 and 1986, we did 3 or 4 amazing information gathering processes to demonstrate to ourselves and to the women and to their communities and to our city of the number of people who were migrants, who were living in terrible conditions in the city, who were being evicted and depleted of whatever little assets they had, and the role and function they played in the city. We did these studies because we found that conventional researchers had all the attributes that Lata and Christina talked about. They were obnoxious, they were rude, they were extractive, and they actually didn't care about our goals of what we wanted. They wanted it to be a study that would help in their papers or whatever. And out of this came a whole methodology of functioning, which is now part of Shack Dwellers International, which use the methodologies of information gathering, priority setting, assessment of impact of the choices that we made as a methodology that urban groups used in order to start dialogue and negotiations with their governments on their right to live in the city. And what we call this is data collection to demonstrate the power of aggregation that was important not only for the community, women and their neighborhoods, but also very solid evidence of the fact that conventional data, census data did not include these communities in their process. It was almost 3 or 4 years later in 1988-89 that David Satterthwaite and I met, and he was just amazed at what was happening and asked us to write an article which came out in the first Environment and Urbanization journal. We were nagged to death, pushed and bullied by him to write it the way we wanted it. And from there came a very interesting relationship with the Human Settlements Group, not only with SPARC, but subsequently with STI, with the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, all community-based regional and global movements, where we decided what we wanted to do. Whenever we felt we needed some ideas and assistance, we would ask for advice. And we took for granted that that is how Northern researchers would behave with us. It was only when we started getting invited to participate in other research projects that we realized all the things that Lata was talking about. Everybody wanted to subvert the way in which we did our data collection. They wanted to subvert the questions that were going to be asked. They wanted to like excavate people's lives when they had not, it had nothing to do with what we wanted to get done. So our way of doing things was, what do you need to ask? You shouldn't ask people to spend more than 15 to 20 minutes of their time to ask the information. If you wanted subjective stuff, you had group discussions in which everybody spoke about their feelings, values, and specific things. All these things were rejected by many of the researchers who came to visit us. And it's been now over 20 years that we've been doing this. And increasingly, there is a readiness to acknowledge the power of these methodologies in the transformative negotiations with duty bearers. The other part that I want to say in the aspect of colonialism is that in cities all over the world, and in STI, we have colonists that are not only British, but French, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, Belgian. And we see how their own colonial rights frameworks on land, the appropriation of local traditional lands into planning systems that work for colonial administration still exist in our countries. And we fight these at very, very basic levels because they are exclusionary, they marginalize more than 30 to 70% of people who live in cities. And they legitimate what our present elite want to do, which is more or less stay with the colonial extractive mechanism. So what was a foreign colonial subjugation of communities has now become legitimated by our own elite. So our own researchers behave not very differently from this. And it's only when we see a respect and a commitment and a support structure to what we believe we want to do that long-term partnerships and long-term engagements then produce a trust that sometimes actually welcomes some of these suggestions that international researchers suggest to us, anticipating some of the challenges and problems that we may face, but which we take with much deeper trust and acceptance and become ready to explore. I also want to say that the issue of language translation, interpretation is a very, very important aspect of knowledge creation with very poor communities. We know whenever we ask professional interpreters to come, if you take our Indian Federation, people speak 12 languages and we do our own translations. And we have a big difference between what we call translation, where it's a literal translation of what they said in another language, versus interpretation, where the interpreter's values and knowledge in some ways transforms or dilutes or destroys the essence of what was originally spoken. And we find that our whole process of producing very major aggregated data, which can also be disaggregated to the smallest group, is a fundamental difference in the kind of information gathering, both qualitative and quantitative, that we do. And so we find that more and more of our colleagues in STI now use these methods. And it takes an exceptional Northern researcher to actually negotiate with us what we do. But we also find that many of our own intermediary professionals, like I am an intermediary professional activist, we find that our own education in the Global South also trains us to believe that the theories that we learn are superior to the theory building that we do with communities. And so it's not just the Northern researchers that impose certain perspectives or things on us. It's also many of our own Southern activist professionals whose education needs to be unlearned in order to produce knowledge creation that we need for our movement building. Yeah, so finally, what I want to say is that we believe that the pursuit of knowledge is a fundamental right of disenfranchised communities. And it's a very important part of building their capacities to make representation, to negotiate, to explore partnerships, and to find solutions that work for them. It's as important in the assessment of the strategies that they use when they monitor and assess these processes. And we believe that the increased awareness, increased acknowledgement, and increased utilization of these bottom-up approaches of knowledge creation have to get greater and greater acknowledgement, resource provision, and partnerships. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheila. let's have the Q&A now. I'll start with Rosanna's question that's in the chat later, if you want to respond to that. And I encourage everybody else, if you have a question to the speakers, just raise your hand or post it in the chat. Thanks. Lata?
Yep. No, thank you. Thanks first to those, to Christina and Sheila. That's been really, really interesting and really lovely to share this platform with you. And I learned a lot, so thank you for that. Rosanna, it's a really important question. If you felt comfortable doing so, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know how else to do it. If you can maybe, if you can explain to me how you feel that it's not competition over collaboration before I respond, because I think I want to understand your question properly.
Yeah, okay. Well, no, thank you so much. And I loved your presentation, very valid points. I'm just thinking in a country like ours in Finland, we have what, 17 universities only, and maybe 23 universities of applied sciences. And what from my perspective, where I sit, and we're helping, trying to do research with the global south, and more the funding instruments actually call for collaboration with different institutions. So there's very few of those funding instruments where you can go to it as a single, let's say, Finnish institution in any case. That, with the EU instruments, you need at least 2 EU countries or 3. So I feel like the consortia are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, compared to having just one institution do. So, and then with initiatives like this training as well, this is another one where we're being encouraged to collaborate nationally, because to reduce that sort of thing. So I kind of think that we have been moving towards more and more collaboration. And then when it comes to work with the global south, I don't think that you can do that alone as an institution. Say, okay, University of Helsinki or University of Lapland or whatever, go somewhere and do something in Kenya or in Bolivia by themselves. They do need partners. So I'm a bit on this thing that, okay, how do you frame that?
No, and it's a really important question, and I think Sheila will have things to say about it. So I will sort of give her that space to say that. And I think she said some things in her talk that give a sense of where that the even partnership and collaboration is hierarchical. But I'm not going to speak on that, because I think Sheila is obviously best placed to do that. But I would just say that this is absolutely the direction of travel in higher education everywhere. I mean, we are being incentivized. It's all about partnerships. You have to demonstrate that you have this or that. But there's a number of things that are coming out of that are potentially not being talked about enough. So, for instance, there's obviously the inbuilt hierarchies where if it's the global north, if you like, that controls the money, invariably that's where the research agendas sit. Now, that isn't about ill will from any of us who might be doing that, and I never ever take myself out of this. I am very much implicated in these structures. I am actively involved in them. I can only go so far to dismantle them. So I'm very much see myself as part of the problem and trying to work out how to be part of the solution. So I don't say that as if it's outside of me. I'm in it. But that's very much how we are being incentivized to work. But there's the first thing is that we have these hierarchies that are being created. The incentives for competition come in how our work is credited. So it could be that, yes, we are being encouraged to collaborate, but I have every incentive to make sure that on all those lovely, shiny, peer-reviewed articles that we write, I'm named as first author, because otherwise I'm not going to get promotion. That doesn't make me a horrible person. That is the institutional incentive within which I function. And that's very difficult to dismantle. So we've had long chats in our groups where we're sort of thinking, okay, how do we do this? And the reality is, which is where the point I was making about idea formulation, the way in which we frame and conceptualize the problem is almost done at our desks before we even seek out the partners. The other slightly and here I can't speak for Finland. I would not want to claim any insight into Finland, so I rely on all of you to tell me how it is. But in the UK context, partnership has also been a wheeze to drive what effectively is ODA funding, and we can and should problematize ODA funding. But let's just take that as a pot of money that exists, that we might use to do a lot of what Christina's saying. How do we amplify not our own voices, right? That's a perfectly reasonable thing. Quite a lot of that money has been used to actually rechannel it toward UK-based researchers on the basis that that is going to be meeting development goals. So it's been a wheeze. So there's lots and lots of ways. And the final point I would make is that we make dangerous assumptions in a lot of our funding about money going towards capacity building. My experience of working with Global South colleagues is they don't need me to build their capacity. So it's incredibly patronizing the way a lot of this funding is framed. Like, oh, I'm going to go from the Global North with my big pot of money, and I'm going to empower all these Global South researchers to be as clever as me. And that's literally the opposite. And that for me is deeply frustrating, because that language is so patronizing, but it's also built in. Now, again, I cannot speak for how Finnish money may be more enlightened than that. I'd love to hear about it, but that is certainly the way it's framed. So then we try, okay, can we talk about capacity building for early career researchers, but capacity for what? Who gets to decide that capacity has been built? Why is the starting point that I have capacity and somebody in the Global South doesn't? So we end up in a situation where it's the same research centers in about 4 different African countries that just get overloaded to do research because they're the only ones that have the capacity to engage with Global North funding regimes in the first place. So, but there's so much to do. And I'm not, as I said, I really, really don't want to be heard as if I'm speaking for the Finnish context. I don't have an insight into that and rely on all of you to tell me. Anyway, look, Sheila's had hand up for a long time, so I apologize. But that would be my response. But it's a really good question, Rosanna, and I appreciate you asking it. So I'll turn over to Sheila now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lata. Sheila?
See, I feel that one of the ways by which Northern and Southern institutions, activist organizations like ours, even research organizations, long-term partnerships help renegotiate external, sort of views that have to be changed. We find that people who just come in and very, very quickly, the usual strategy is somebody will come and say, oh, I've written this proposal, I need 2 Southern partners. Do you know, can we have you and somebody else? And we've already worked it out and we do something later, but nothing changes. And we are supposed to do exactly what they want. They get 4/5 of the money. We get piddly amounts of money. And after the first one, we just say, no, thank you, we don't want to do it. But we now have long-term relationships as STI with almost 15 to 20 universities with researchers who actually make a lot of investment in developing a very primary relationship in which they demonstrate that they care about what we want. It's pretty much like what Christina was saying, because I want to give you the example of the relationship we have with Diana Mitlin when she was part of Human Settlements Group, and subsequently when she moved to Manchester. She did a radical thing. Every year she used to invite a team of 2 professionals and 2 community leaders to teach her class. And out of that came a program where her students did placements with us based on the relationship that was established in the engagement that they had in Manchester. And so today, when they have a large research, for instance, where about 12 countries with Southern researchers and STI members work together, the relationships are very, very different because they are navigated, negotiated, and assisted by many people who have been engaged in long-term relationships which are respectful, which acknowledge the local needs for information gathering, legitimation of what people need to get done locally. That's one set. The other set is, I want to respond to Lata's discussion about being the principal researcher for paper. Most of us don't care about papers and anything else as long as our needs, our legitimation of what we want to do gets undertaken with the same gravitas. Because while in the university system, you may need to have those papers to retain your position, we need cutting edge information representation of our work in order to negotiate for the things that we want. So how respectful are we of each other? And the third thing is that how much support do we get to build the confidence to argue back with your back institutions? And I want to give an example. 2 years ago, or last year, when the UKRI said, "Oh, we are going to cut all the things," and we were in 3 or 4 projects like that. I was invited to speak to the council members of UKRI, and I said, "How dare you do these things? You make us write legal commitments that we will not get out of this, we won't do this, we won't do that, and you unilaterally withdraw with absolutely no acknowledgement or understanding of what's happening." So the other point is, how does the understanding of the politics of the North become available to us to make representations on our own behalf and to challenge this North-South divide? Because even major institutions are pretending or trying to overcome this colonial behavior, because now it's so politically incorrect. So the ability to challenge it, the ability to renegotiate, if it is increased in your southern partners, then your own partnerships get strong. And I would say to our Finnish friends, you reach out to make long-term relationships with the kinds of issues and communities that you care about. And you will find that your ability to quickly produce project solutions emerges from that long-term and long-standing relationship. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Good points from both you and Lata. A lot about also understanding the needs and context of the Southern partners and why they'll be wanting to participate in your research and other points. There's another question now. This is from Ashwin. And Ashwin, if I don't explain this properly, please let me know. So he's asking, are there any guidelines or cheat sheets? So this is a very practical question, which summarize how the language can be more inclusive when creating call text for funding proposals or for conference structures. I don't know if there are cheat sheets, but I suspect what he wants to know is how can it be done better, is creating call text and funding proposals for conferences and workshops. Anyone?
I think nothing substitutes solid partnerships. Very often the person who is on the spot has to respond. And you can't create a cheat sheet or a strategy without a comfortable long-term relationship of trust. So that when our northern partners speak on our behalf, we have no fear that will be misrepresented, because we get reported to, we're asked, what do you want to say? How do you want to do this? And we also are aware of the politics of how ODA funding and other northern research funding is done. So it's not like we are naive or ignorant about the politics that exists in northern institutions and their research agendas. So for instance, in migration, every southern organization will tell you that most of the issues on international migration are more to look at how to keep out migrants rather than do anything with them in its fundamental perspective. The question is, do you have a partnership that's strong enough to upset this cartwheel? Now, the point is, what do you want to do with these things? And I think that cannot come out of a shortcut relationship before a proposal.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thought provocative. Christina, you wanted to respond as well?
Yes, I was just thinking that reminding me of a workshop we had in lockdown. Was meant to be an international in-person workshop with Indigenous peoples, which we would have had money for 2 or 3 people to come. But because of the virtual format, we actually engaged Indigenous speakers from across the world, and they were the majority of participants. So regardless of the language that we used in the workshop, they actually provided most of the presentations as the experts, and we had many academics, at least 50 or more academics doing most of the listening. So it was a really nice way of turning things on its head and having the Indigenous peoples as the experts and the academics as the learners in that case, in that context. So if you're designing a workshop, I would say, going virtual provides all these possibilities to make things much more inclusive and to really recognize the expertise of these, Southern groups, whose voices are really not heard in academic circles. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christina, for that solid example. I hope, Ashwin, your question's answered. There's also, Lata's posted something in the chat that you can look into. Johanna, you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Johanna Kivimäki, the director of UniPID. We have been kind of incentivizing these workshops. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much for all the presenters. Just to kind of maybe to reflect shortly on Lata's kind of concerns about this ODA-funded research and capacity building. So, and kind of a reflection from the Finnish national perspective, we do have ODA-funded development research and also these kind of higher education institutions capacity building kind of projects. I definitely kind of sense that your notions, Lata, were somewhat correct to be applied to Finnish context as well. I guess the problem is the ODA-based funding and the kind of background or that it's actually based in the kind of northern or western kind of development policy. So that's already the starting point, which kind of makes it quite hard to make it something else in a way, even though these kind of expectations are for basing the kind of projects on the needs defined by the Southern partners and so on. So there's always the kind of Finnish development policy which defines it. And then I guess it's a bit hard to see where the incentive for the projects comes in any case. Of course, there's a lot of diversity in the ways these partnerships are built and the projects are designed and so on. I know that there's many that are very long-term partnerships and so on. And probably kind of also with people who have this intention to decolonize the partnerships and so on. So I believe there's a lot of kind of diversity. But I was kind of thinking, now that Christina went off, but if there's any, I got kind of interested of this seed funding idea, that there would be this kind of pre-workshops for these partnerships, seed funding, before the whole kind of project is actually defined, which helps to kind of then workshop on the methodology, which is created jointly and so on. And I think this is definitely lacking in Finland. I don't know if in the British context or somewhere else there's kind of good practices on this. I would be very interested in this because we are also pretty much in contact also with the policymakers and the funding agencies. We always provide them kind of advice on how to improve the instruments. And we definitely in UniPID have a lot to learn. And I think I've been learning so much already from this workshop. So I'm would be really interested in knowing about any good practices regarding this as well, and what we could then push forward, even links or whatever if there is, so that could be helpful.
Lata, thank you, Johanna. Lata or Sheila?
Sheila had hands up first, so I'll let Sheila go.
Okay, great. I'll actually,
Thank you.
This will be the last issue because we need to go into breakout room.
Yeah, so I feel that the initial funds serve several purposes. One is it actually helps the two partners to actually negotiate amongst themselves about their own priorities and to make a strategy of who needs to do what to produce something that fulfills the challenge to get money, as well as to address the issues that uh, especially southern groups that are not in university or just research focused groups want to do. It also gives an opportunity for a deeper engagement with communities that have to participate in this process, so that right in the beginning you bring all the diverse partnerships into this process. And I think that for me constitutes real capacity building. Capacity building is not to push somebody else to do something that's useful for you, but to develop an agreement on how the skill sets that different people have will be sharpened, deepened, where values will be explored and a deeper understanding of each other's role and functions is understood. For me, that is capacity building. The present capacity building notion from the North usually is an imposition of rules and regulations that they feel the Southern partners need to know in order not to produce risks and challenges to the project when it happens. If that's the case, you shouldn't even start the partnership, in my opinion. So I feel that uh, I would really encourage the Finnish research groups to explore a reformulation of a preparatory phase for the project development, in which it is you don't have to be apologetic about what views you as fund providers have, but you allow the constituencies to bring in the concerns that they have, and you create a space for acknowledging that you give as much value for the local requirements that communities may have that get fulfilled by the research, and that they can coexist with the information and the evidence or the outcomes that the funding was designed for. And our experience of the last 20 years shows that primary donors, the fund creators and providers, actually become very respectful when exposed to this process. So I think the important thing is that we put ourselves in a circle of exploration rather than a hierarchy. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sheila. And Lata, if you could respond, and then briefly, so that we can move to the next section.
Absolutely. I mean, Sheila's made some excellent points there about, it really has to be about building trust, and I would agree. I'm really happy if you'd like me to. So I've been involved in different sorts of things where, like concretely, getting bid creation funding. So both there've been two big calls for these consortia building kind of grants, and I'm really happy, Joanna, if maybe I can sort of seek out support for you to take some examples back. I wasn't sort of arranging it, but I'm aware I was involved. I am currently part of one of these Global Challenges Research Fund. This was one, Rosanna, just to go back to the discussion we had about your question, it was a little bit of a wheeze to meaning that, sort of trying to distribute ODA monies within the UK for the purposes of development. But having said that, some of these things did come into that place, credit where credit's due. And one of the things they did was provide money for partners to physically be in the same space. So that meant that you identified your partners, and we had a first meeting at the sort of the host university. But what is now FCDO also did the same thing for these big consortia grants they did. Now that had a mixed success in terms of how well the funding was used in terms of bringing Global South partners, but the money was made available. So if you're really wanting to sort of talk to Finnish policymakers, there is concrete examples. I'm happy to sort of pick that up afterwards if you like and connect you to people that you might be able to talk to. I wouldn't be the right person, but really happy to connect you, Ava and Joanna, if that's helpful, because it is, well, Ava, you may already be aware, obviously being Manchester based, but it is, yeah, lots of people we can connect you to here. There's some good examples of where they've done that in the UK.
Thanks,
That's
Lata. Brilliant.
Sorry,
Johanna.
thanks.
No, Johanna, that was my mistake. Thanks, Lataya. Actually, good point to bring up these global research funds, because I think those are some of the ones as well that Sheila is talking that were sort of cut up during the pandemic and had a lot of impacts with partners in the South, very bad, sort of a significant impact, but we can talk about that later. Actually, I want to extend that same invitation to anybody in this group that if you have some question that you've not been able to ask and you'd like to ask one of the presenters, just send it to me via email and I'll pass it on and we'll respond back to you, including any requests for, like, I don't know, links and things like that. So I realized that I have allowed a lot of time for discussion, which I think is not necessarily a bad thing, because I really hope that you've gained a lot from it. But I want us to go to the next section. I hope people have had a chance to go to the bathroom. Everybody can see my screen? Yes? Brilliant. So we're going to go into groups, and you're going to be about maybe 6 to 8 people per group. And I want us to have 10 minutes. I've reduced the time. Rosanna, Hongling, and Samia, you'll notice I've reduced the time because we've gone quite over. So I want you to have 10 minutes where I want you to have sort of like a reflection. So we've had quite a lot of information today about framing and, you know, the thinking behind our how we come up with our research methodologies, research questions, things like that. So I want you to reflect about your specific context and the specific work you are involved in. And I want you to discuss this, and you're going to have Padlet, which if you don't feel like talking, you can input your thoughts into, and I encourage you to do that. So 3 questions. You don't have to respond to all of them. Feel free to sort of, you have a facilitator in the group, but feel free to sort of address this in different ways. But I want you to feel free, it's a safe space, and that part of the section is not recorded. Then after 10 minutes, I want us to be a bit more focused in thinking about some, not solutions, I cannot call them solutions, but rethinking, like how we can rethink sort of the things that come up in this reflection part. So for instance, think about how you, as an academic or a project manager or whatever your role is, how you can open up spaces for free thinking in your own partnerships, in your projects, in your research, like how you can allow that critique of the dominant research culture in which you're working in, which as of now, we know is very much Northern-based, dictated by dead white men. And then how can you strengthen or create value of other forms of thinking in your project or research? So I know these are very deep questions, and I'm not expecting that you're going to come up with some very sort of like blueprint actions, but just to get us towards that mindset of bringing about change. So 10 minutes for each of those, and I'm going to post the Padlet links in the chat, including who your group leaders are. I know you might not have access to this, but your group leaders are, so they'll post this in the chat for you when you go to your groups. And I'm going to open the rooms now. Then Lata, who is the expert in this room right now, is going to be going from room to room while this is happening. I'll let her decide what she does when she comes into your room. And then we'll be back here where I expect my 3 facilitators, Rosanna, Hongling, and Samia, to tell me what has been discussed. So I'm opening the rooms now unless there are any questions. No questions. Brilliant. Okay, opening rooms.
So we talked about what, what principal norms and values and worldviews shape the projects, and who do you design them with, and what experiences you've had where you felt uncomfortable. And well, one of the first issues was how to engage actively with, how to engage in active collaboration, and how to engage with partners, and how to engage e-partners, especially if you're in a coordinating role. The issues that came in as well was sometimes there is a lack of real collaboration, especially when you don't hear the voices of the participants for various reasons. There could be always voices that are heard all the time, and then there are those persons who don't, or institutions that don't necessarily feel they have the space to give their voice out. And then, having limitations in defining other forms of being and other types of knowledges, because perhaps we don't know about them, or you don't have access to information about them. And also looking at, these are not documented anywhere. So this is hard to define. There was an issue in terms of having discomfort, for instance, when, women's rights, child labor, and some issues like these might be uncomfortable to work with, especially where these may be an issue in certain countries, and maybe clear ethical reasons on your own part, and differing, I'll say, differences in ethics and values and moral juxtapositions between people and partners. So these can make people feel uncomfortable. But when we think about the rethinking part of this, one was listen to the partners, and listen to your collaborators. Approach individual partners separately to hear the voices that are not represented. When it comes to, we did talk a little bit about funding, so that the funder allocates the funding, and that drives the agenda in terms of who is the collaboration being done for, and who's how is that project research. So the funding basically drives this agenda. So there was a really good suggestion by Noshme talking about rewriting the agenda, so that it addresses the funding goal, but then it focuses on local context and user methodologies that are context related, being participatory. Important to have literature on different types of knowledge, but then we came back to an issue that, okay, not everything is documented. And drafting the project from the beginning in an open, shared, participatory process, and allowing space for maybe creating mixed pairs, people from different countries to come up with descriptions of work packages, creating the partnerships before. So and talk to each other before the funding calls are even open, discuss about different interests, different methods of gathering information. And so this pre-workshopping discussion and seed funding for this sort of activities is seen as important.
Okay,
but
Rosanna, I'll have to stop you there.
I'm done.
Thank you. So I've seen your Padlet is quite populated. So I'll actually print this and attach it to the slides after this. Samia?
Yes, thank you. I think in terms of our reflections, I think generally a feeling that a lot of what has been said resonates with people in different ways. And we have different perspectives from a funding or an organization that facilitates collaboration, where, for example, it was pointed out that sometimes you operate within guidelines that you are yourself critical of, but you kind of like have to implement them because you're working for the body, the organization that, has that mandate. But even there, within those spaces, there are often opportunities if one is critical enough and one pays attention and is committed to that. There are opportunities to kind of like smash existing structures or work around them or create that flexibility for different kinds of engagement. Another perspective from a research perspective, particularly in the area of human rights research, for example, we reflected on the possibility to critically engage with that very concept itself. So not only to do human rights research differently in different contexts and different nations, regions of the world, but actually linked to, I think, Lata's discussion of a critical engagement with sustainable development, and here to kind of like question the very concept of human rights themselves and whose purpose they serve. Another perspective was the funding perspective, and I think Rosanna, you touched on that also. Our entry point into that was a little bit different because we realized in one of the projects that was quoted that there is money being made available by Finnish from a Finnish source, but the money can only be used in Finland for Finnish institutions, but it is a project that collaborates with India. So the question is, how does this money benefit Indian colleagues? And in this particular instance, they were able to find co-funding through Finnish companies that operate in India and work in India. But of course, these additional things, first of all, you have to be critical about these funding flows and where the money comes from and who it benefits. Also, a requirement for co-funding in itself is quite restrictive in terms of who you then can work with, because you then have to look for partners who can either afford to put their own money in or who can attract funding from other sources. So it's already, in terms of who do we serve and whose voices we hear, we're kind of like creating other levels of restrictions and selection as to who can work with us. And linked to that, and this is perhaps the second part now of what we can do about it, how we can rethink our practices and approaches, is the realization that all of this additional work really takes a lot of time and effort. And that it is actually something when we organize projects, we have to build that in, not only in terms of time, but also in terms of money, perhaps budget, that we actually have to allocate to have these conversations and to have these explorations. And so the other thing that was as a sort of a general guideline is persistence. These are all issues that we can't do once and then be done with. And we have to continue to work on them. We have to be persistent, bring them up again and again within the same project or across different projects. And obviously, it's very important in terms of partnership work to actually have the capacity to build long-term relationships where you can build trust and understanding, where you can explore all of these things and really find ways in which everyone benefits. And then I will not be able to relay Katarina's input right at the end, because unfortunately she was also cut short. So if there is a possibility for her to come in and make her comment, that would be wonderful. But I think that's where I'm going to leave it in a nutshell.
Thanks a lot, Samia. Katrina, I'll give you a minute before I ask Lata to give out 2-minute wrap up. There you are.
No, I mean, it was nothing, I mean, it had come up many times, but I just wanted to emphasize that this need of really including the partners early on, that is perhaps the one thing that I will, from this whole course, will really remember, that somehow build in that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Lata, do you want to wrap up with 1 minute? And then I want to tell everybody goodbye and give you one final shot to do our Slido game with me.
I just wanted to say thank you. I think you've all raised so many interesting things, and I've learned a lot and really enjoyed the engagement with you. And I hope it's not the last time. It's the beginning. I suppose the main thing for me is I hope all of you feel that this session has really emphasized how this is a process, not an outcome. That for me is always the abiding lesson. We never have to stop asking ourselves these questions. I also think that it's fantastic if if there's a way of using some of the language that we're forced to use. So, better partnerships make us more effective. I think that's a good way to think about it. And, if there's ways that we can support each other to push back, to do this work better, I look forward to finding those ways to do that together. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for engaging. And yeah, it's been really lovely to meet all of you. And thank you, Eva, for the invitation.
Thank you, Lata. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks to everybody who's put your input into the Slido. And I want to thank you all for participating. And the next workshop is on fieldwork, and it's going to be led by Hongling Chen, who's in this session today, together with another colleague from China. And I really look forward to seeing anybody who's registered to that come in there next week.